When I ask UX people who practice user research what is their biggest challenge, I usually hear how hard it is to engage stakeholders with research. What are your thoughts on this topic, Vic?
So one thing about engaging stakeholders, I agree with that sentiment, but the thing about it that I would sort of add or maybe put a caveat in, depending on which way we're looking at it, is that a lot of times people have trouble moving it up front in the process. So before you'd find that stakeholders understand, they'll sort of say, we want to do usability work. And usability to them really means a check mark at the end of development cycles before it's ready to launch. But now I think the biggest challenge is to have people move it forward into the process and say, right at the beginning, at the onset, before you even get into development, what is the best way for us to be able to integrate good user research so that we make sure that we know who our users are and understand exactly what we're trying to do before we even start to really begin coding. I find that sometimes stakeholders have a bit of a wall. They think so focused in terms of the development timelines, which I don't fault them for at all. But what happens is it becomes this date that they're trying to move towards, and they get very nervous about it. So anything that's going to take time up front, I think it causes a bit of anxiety. That's probably one of the things I would add into that statement that you said.
I'm hearing from UX practitioners who work in agencies as well as from self-employed ones that research is usually the first thing to make it out of a project after a client says a project proposal. How do you position UX research to your stakeholders to prevent this from happening?
Okay, so I thought about that so you're saying in terms of...
A project that is including probably design of something.
Okay.
And the proposal includes design and research.
So I don't know, it depends also if you're in-house, you're in-house UX person versus a consultant.
Yep.
In my situation, what happens most of the time is they know they want to do research, and they get in touch with me because that's what I tend to do a lot of in terms of my consulting. So I find that people will call me in and say, we really need to figure this out about our users. We're having issues. Can you help us out? So I don't feel like I don't really have to fight for that. It's more like I'm being brought in for that. One of the things I like to tell my clients is that by doing that upfront user research, it's really not only the research, but you're really getting a very, very strong definition of exactly who your users are, who your constituents are. And then also being able to say, here's who they are, and here's how we'd like to measure them. Here are the gaps that they're having in the particular task that they're trying to achieve, or the goal that they're trying to make their way towards. And being able to measure that and understand how we can measure the gap and then check how well we did in closing that gap when we are out to design. I think that's what I find brings the most value to people when I tell them that about user research up front.
Imagine, you mentioned an in-house practitioner. So imagine an in-house UX researcher who's always trying to identify opportunities for effective research. What would you recommend they do to better identify such opportunities?
I mentioned measurements. I'm really, really big on measurements. So there are times when you're doing work in-house, it's always different than when you're doing work as a consultant. It's day-to-day. It's sometimes the rug will be pulled out from underneath you, and sometimes you will have a stakeholder who comes to you and says, I need you as part of everything that we're doing. It really runs the gamut in terms of how that solution works out. But what I strongly recommend, I say this in my classes, I say this to my clients, is to focus on measurement. One thing that I found that is definitely changing in this field is that when we look at the work that we do in the user experience realm, starting from concept to concept and research all the way to design to evaluation, is that people originally were looking a lot more at qualitative information. So, we had a number of people tell us that they were very unhappy with our product and that they would switch to a competitor in 30 seconds or less. That's lovely. But what I'd like to see is measurement, so much more quantitative results in terms of, I'm trying to achieve this task. The way we have the application set up now and how it's designed, it must take me easily about 10 minutes more per task. That doesn't make sense to me. That's a waste of my time. So I find that talking about it in terms of time in terms of time that you can map to then costs. If you put an average billing rate to somebody's time, I think that's really important, where you talk about it in terms of cost savings or revenue generation. And I think when we can talk about it in terms of something that everybody talks the same language on, so it doesn't matter if I'm marketing, doesn't matter if I'm development, doesn't matter if I'm product management, if everybody's talking in terms of costs, we can play that game much better then. So I find that if you're in-house, measurements is the strongest way to go.
UX researchers sometimes experience a tension between conducting research they were asked to do by their stakeholders, for example, a product manager, versus research that they were not asked to do but think they should do. What are your thoughts on balancing this tension?
So again, if I'm an external consultant, I don't find I have that tension too often. Most of my, I sort of laugh as I say this, most of my clients that know me know I'm very outspoken, and my students in my class know that as well. So often if there is a direction that my client is going in that I feel is, they're missing the boat on something, or hey, you know what, there's, this half of the spectrum that you're looking at, I'd like you to also consider this. I feel like that's part of my responsibility to them as a consultant, to tell them that they really need to be looking at a much larger picture. And sometimes that's met with, oh, that's great, that's what we need from you. And sometimes that's met with, I'm sorry, we have to stick to this scope right now. What I try to do, though, is to tell them that we need a story to move forward with, so that whatever our plan is, let's say we can't do it right away, let's say it's something that we cannot consider right away, we want to make sure that we have a plan for it, to do it at some point in time. Again, weaving in that conversation of measurement and metrics, if we can show that, hey, you know what, this looks weak here, why is it that's even bubbled up to the surface that we have this issue? Let's look at everything that's contributing to the negative experience of that particular issue. And if we can measure it, and if we can say, we need to be able to do a better job at this, or if we do a better job, we can, again, save this much money, or save this much money for our client, prove to them that they will continue to save money, or we can generate more revenue, which is great for people who are for-profit businesses. These are all things that I would sort of encourage them, I think is the best way to say it, to make sure that they look at it, they consider it carefully, and that they don't just brush it off to the side and sort of ignore it.
So you talked about a story, now I'm going to ask you to tell me a story.
Okay.
Tell me a story about a difficult stakeholder who did not understand or respect UX research. And you don't have to name names.
I don't think I would. A difficult stakeholder.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one comes to mind that happened in the last few months. I think recency is probably the best way to go. So this was a company who, it's the best way to define them. They are in the business of creating children's software for education, used in a variety of different methods. They also meet special needs for some children. So as you can imagine, the constituents that will be using the product, it's quite varied. We have children, we have adults, parents of the children who help them use the software. And then we also have teachers, administration, and the school board, so to speak. So that sort of set of people also who are interested in using the application. It was very interesting where I sat down with this company. They have some beautiful products, and they asked me to review a few of them just as part of an existing relationship. And I reviewed them, but I realized that the high-level structure of the application was a bit weak. So it didn't, again, tell a really good story. So one thing I really love to do is looking at my work and my design. I wanted to tell a good story so that when people look at it, they know sort of what to do, where to go, where to start, the basics of a good experience. And when I spoke with, there was two people in the meeting, and the primary stakeholder, one thing that he sort of, I noticed right away, he was looking at me a bit quizzically is the best way to put it. And when I told him, I was asking him questions about what's your design methodology, do you do upfront research, do you go and meet with parents, do you go meet with students, do you go meet with teachers, he just kept on nodding his head. And I realized that I didn't think I was really getting through. And when I asked him about design methodology, the other individual in the meeting right away started laughing. She said, I guess we have one. I'm not really sure, but okay, if that's what you call it. Which also makes me a bit nervous, because to me design methodology has to be very stark. At the end of my recommendation of, hey, let's look at this high-level structure over again, let's understand what we're trying to do, we can take it out, we can evaluate, we can do it very iteratively, as most of my colleagues do in this particular type of work, he just stopped and he said, you know what, I have worked with people like you. We have PhDs in education and in psychology and in sociology. We have all of those guys here, and they're doing a great job. We really don't need somebody like you to come in. And I smiled and I said, okay, I understand that. And I said, well, what do you think I'm bringing to the table? What do you think it is? What value do you think I would be providing to you? And he says, we don't need to evaluate. We create the material and we give it to them and they use it. And I thought that was really interesting, because I thought, wow, in especially I think education now, where education and how much technology can help education move along, how it can interact with students in a really positive environment, in a positive format, and the fact that kids are learning at this, oh my God, incredibly rapid rate, to see them pick up anything and to see how quickly they can learn it now. There's no barriers and there's no fear of trying new things. And I think that's something that we can really push the envelope on, and be able to not only research, but to also evaluate and say, okay, well, some things tend to work better for some children, especially with children in special needs also. I found that there could be a lot of opportunity to work and understand and again, make it much more positive for them in terms of the learning environment. And it was just very interesting how he shut it down immediately and said it's too expensive. When I had somebody a few years back run an evaluation on a design that we were doing, it cost them $70,000, and I don't understand why it's so expensive, but we don't have the budget for that. And I was thinking to myself again, it doesn't need to cost more than $10K nowadays, really, in terms of running something very quick for evaluation. So it was very interesting, and we left it at that, and I went in for some other work here and there, but I found it very interesting how he had an opinion, and he was a public school teacher for 20 plus years. So it was very, very interesting to see, sort of how his impression was. And I gave him lots of great stories, lots of great metrics and facts, but I don't think it worked.
So I want to ask you something about that.
Sure.
So you were a consultant, so you could just, leave and move on.
Absolutely.
In-house practitioners don't have that privilege. So what should they do when they see these people that, that are blocking them, or whatever it is that you're calling this behavior or opinions? What should they do?
One of the things that it's a great question, because in all fairness, I have never worked full-time at a product company. I've always been a consultant. I think I say this to my students, I know myself very well, and I will be very passionate about pushing for something, and then I will stop if I can't get past a certain point. Because to me, there's good reason for why we do the methodology the way we do, and I would, as a consultant, say, this is the best way to do it, but if not, hey, I'm okay and I'll walk away. In-house, you have to be much more tenacious. So what I would recommend, first of all, again, is to go back to those metrics and say, okay, well, let's see what is happening. So if I am in the natural, whatever their design methodology was, and they certainly had something, because they were coming out with software and it was being used by a number of different people, I would start to, even if it's just at the tail end, to start measuring how long are people taking to learn the product, what are the frustrations that are coming back, what are the amounts of time that we're spending on training for this product, what are some of the calls that we're getting back for repetitive issues. And they did have some repetitive issues, and there was a lot of eye rolling when, especially with the other individual in the meeting, when I was asking them about, do you find that there's any pain areas in this application that you struggle with, that you would really like to improve? And the eye rolling began and said, oh yes, oh gosh, you wouldn't believe how many calls and questions that we got in this particular area. It just doesn't make any sense, and we have to do a better job of it. So when there's always comments like that people will share, that I would use as little niblets. And one thing I definitely advocate, that I know a lot of my colleagues do as well, is start small, start really tiny. So if there's a way to, if this gentleman was actually somebody that I'd have to get past, I would start really small and be able to start collecting those metrics and say, okay, well, what if we did this a little differently? Or, hey, let's just take this one little piece and let's design it slightly differently and show how the methodology is going to work a little bit better. Evaluate and get back. It might not even make it to the development, but to be able to say that you have given it a snapshot of metric and measurement and proof to say that it's going in the right direction, that's how I would say I'd want to tackle it. That takes a lot of patience, and I'm not sure if I have the most patience in the world, but that's how I would approach it.
All right. Many UX practitioners are always looking for creative deliverables that engage their stakeholders with research findings. What are some deliverables you found to be working well for you?
Okay, so in terms of deliverables and research findings, I think it all depends on the type of research that you're doing. And it's interesting, I actually just had a conversation with somebody about that very recently in terms of the one gap that I find is very hard to fill is going from research, getting most often excellent data, and then being able to take that data and make information out of it and make it meaningful, because now you have to translate all the nuggets that the users and all the stakeholders have shared with you, and you need to be able to translate it into something that's going to actually stopgap an issue that they're dealing with, that your design will hopefully address. So often what I find is the type of deliverables we give then have to be very meaningful. So I will try to take whatever data I come up with, and I often want to come up with something very visual. There's a need for a little bit more help in the industry, I think, in terms of how to take that data and come up with something visual. But if it's something that I can map on a very simple chart with two axes, and I can show where there's two very clear points that I want to move my users to. I'm trying to think of a good example to share with you. So there is a teen health application that I was working on with a client who we were mapping exactly how teens, so if you can imagine, a lot of the data that came back on these teens had to do with their physical health and their well-being versus their sort of self-confidence and their self-image, maybe is a better word. And so what we did was we plotted a lot of the information along those two axes. Does somebody have high self-image and also is very physically healthy and emotionally healthy? Or do they have opposite, low self-image and are not very healthy? Or do they think they're very healthy, but they're actually not very healthy? And as you can imagine, it can go on a whole bunch of different dots in those two axes if you're looking at that. So I try to bring meaning visually instead of just going after core data, and then being able to say, okay, well, depending on the method that we used to get that data, sometimes that itself ends up giving a very interesting deliverable. If we're using collaging, for instance, it will end up being very visual. You have a whole bunch of pictures, you have a lot of statements and topics that people have brought up, and a lot of emotions that people have uncovered, versus maybe a focus group where you have people acting in front of you. And maybe in order to deliver a really, really important point to your clients, instead of presenting it as a PowerPoint presentation, we enact it. And we have something where people are coming into a store and there's a repeated issue that's going on, and you enact it and you have your stakeholders see a particular situation, almost like a play in front of you. There are ways that you can deliver the message of whatever your research is to your clients, and sometimes pack a little bit more punch into it. So I'd say it depends on the research method. It depends on how the data can be presented, whether it can be just straight presentation. But if it's just presentation, how can we make it more visual in order to be able to engage the stakeholders? Because a lot of times if it's just straight slides and lots of text, and I think we start to lose people then.
Last question. How can UX practitioners tell if their stakeholders are bought into research?
They're bought into research. Often I find, again, and I'll say again, because I'm the consultant, it's slightly different. From a consulting point of view, I'd say I know they're bought into it when they not only realize the value of what might just have transpired in terms of a study that we might have just completed, but it's actively looking towards what's that next step. So something I always tell people is if you're starting that whole motion of doing research and getting into the UX methodology, keep the ball rolling. It could be really small. It could be just collecting metrics in the background while you're not doing any design. But keep the ball rolling. What are we going to be looking at next? Don't sort of ever let it come to sort of like that object in motion will stay in motion. We want to keep that object in motion. So whether it's measuring our users a little bit more on a particular area in our application, or maybe it's looking at another pain area within a kiosk that we're defining or a mobile application, whatever it's manifested as, we still want to keep a pulse on it and figure out exactly how things are moving forward. When I see that stakeholders are stepping up to the plate and going, okay, this is great, what else can we do like this? How else can we make this work? And what are other studies that we could do? How often does that happen? Not all the time. But the key is that they see the value of it. When I really know it's exciting to them, it's when they want to be connected with other people. Like, do you know somebody else who's not directly competition to us, but do you know somebody who does a really good job at this particular sliver of work that we're doing? I've worked with a network storage company who I remember very clearly wanted to do a better job of presenting guidelines to how to hook up all their equipment. And I thought, okay, well, if you're looking at hooking up equipment, there's a lot of companies who do an excellent job if they're in the audio and video world. And I hooked up these people. They're not direct competitors at all, but I hooked them up to one another to say, hey, these guys do a really good job of presenting schematics in terms of hooking up equipment. You guys could really benefit with the relationship. And just even hooking up, whether the people are direct UX to UX people in the company or even product management to product management, but being able to take them to that next level or have them, they suddenly might ask me about articles or do you know if there's any other way we can find out more information, or can you help us, even if we can't have you come in and do the work, can you help us, tell us how to start to infuse all of this type of UX methodology into what we're doing? What type of meeting should we have a UX person represented as? If we had a full-time UX person, where all would they start to contribute to different meetings? So you start to see that they start to see that the story is building, and that they can see that the story is moving and that this is actually something that they want to bring to life and keep alive. I think that's when you know that they're really into it.
All right, that's it. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tomer.